My bride called me a useless loser in front of 200 wedding guests, set down her champagne flute, gathered the hem of her gown in one fist, and walked out of our reception without looking back. 2 days later, I was sitting on the cold plank floor of a one-room cabin deep in the Montana wilderness, 90 miles from the nearest paved road, reading a 5-page letter in my dead father's handwriting that told me the land my parents had left me, the land my brother had laughed at, the land my new wife had used as her reason to leave me on the same night she married me was worth $15 billion. But before I tell you what was in that letter, I have to tell you how I ended up on the floor of that cabin, because the road there was paved with the kind of small, quiet humiliations I had been swallowing for my entire life. My name is Garrett Holloway. I was 37 years old in the spring of 2026. I worked as a licensed land surveyor for a mid-sized civil engineering firm in Bakersfield, California. I made $71,000 a year. I had been with the firm for 12 years. I spent my days walking property lines with a total station and a tripod, measuring the exact edges of land that belonged to other people, and I was good at it, patient, meticulous, the kind of surveyor whose plats never came back with corrections, whose boundary calls held up in court when developers challenged them. I did the careful work. Nobody ever thanks a man for the careful work. My father, Errol Holloway, built Holloway Estates from a single strip mall purchase in 1981 into one of the largest privately held real estate firms in Southern California. By the time I was a boy, my father owned office towers in Century City, shopping centers across 3 counties, and a Beverly Hills mansion that turned up in magazines. He was not a cruel man. He was a man of conclusions. And the conclusion he reached about me early and quietly and without ever once raising his voice was that I was not the son the empire would pass to. That son was my brother. Spencer Holloway, 5 years older than me, Wharton class of 2009, walked into Holloway Estates at 26 as a director, ran acquisitions by 30, became president of the firm at 38. He married a former gallery owner named Camilla, kept 2 children and 3 cars, and drove a Porsche to an office where his own name hung on the wall. Spencer was precisely what my father had drafted him to be. I was the other one, the surveyor, the son who measured land instead of buying it. My father told me once when I was 28 and had just declined the MBA he'd offered to pay for that I wasn't built for the deal table. He didn't say it to wound me. He said it the way a man states a fact he considers settled, and the settling was meant as a mercy because it spared me the indignity of trying. Some men close the deal, Garrett, he said over coffee in that Beverly Hills kitchen. And some men make sure the lines are straight. The world needs both. You're the second kind. It was, I think, the closest thing to praise my father ever offered me, and I have spent a great many years turning it over in my hands, unable to decide whether it was kindness or a verdict. My mother, Adelaide, was warmer, though only just. The Holloways were not a warm family. But she remembered that I took my coffee black, and she told me once when I was 31 that I had inherited my grandfather's hands, long-fingered, precise, the hands of a man who measured the world before he trusted it. She said it quietly, the way she said most true things, while my father was in the next room. Your grandfather Tobias surveyed half of Wyoming before there were roads to survey it from. He could look at a valley and tell you what it was worth before anyone else could see it. You have his hands, Garrett, maybe more than that. I asked her if my father knew. She looked at the doorway my father had walked through and said nothing, which was its own answer. I did not ask again. Some questions cost more to answer than their worth, and my mother had spent her whole marriage learning the price of them. My parents died 9 weeks apart. My father went first in February of 2026, an aneurysm in the back of a town car on the 405 freeway, gone before the driver could pull onto the shoulder. My mother followed in late April, a fall, then a hip, then pneumonia in the hospital, then the slow surrender that follows when a person has decided the work of staying is no longer worth the doing. The funeral was at a cathedral in Los Angeles, attended by 400 people who had known my father's money and a dozen who had known my mother's quiet. Spencer gave the eulogy. He spoke about vision. He spoke about Holloway Estates. He spoke about a legacy that would outlast all of us. He mentioned me once near the end as my brother Garrett, who's always been there for the family, the particular phrase older brothers reach for when they cannot think of a single specific thing to say. I spoke for 2 minutes. I thanked my mother for teaching me that measuring a thing honestly was its own kind of love. I did not mention my father. No one noticed because no one was watching the second son at a funeral built around the first. The will was read on the 9th of May, 2026, in a glass-walled conference room at a firm called Aldridge and Crane on the 34th floor of a tower my father had once owned. There was a long table of figured walnut, a wall of windows looking west toward the ocean, and a trust attorney named Whitfield Crane, somewhere past 70, with the unhurried gravity of a man who has spent his career watching families discover what their parents actually thought of them. Spencer was there with Camilla. I was there with my fiancée, Delphine Marsh, who had insisted on coming, who had pressed my hand under the table and whispered that whatever happened, we would face it together. Crane opened the folder and read the preamble in a voice worn smooth by repetition. Then he began with my brother, the Beverly Hills residence and all its contents, the Porsche and the two other vehicles. 100% of the membership units of Holloway Estates Holdings, the operating company, the portfolio, the goodwill, and liquid assets in aggregate of $6 million to be transferred to Spencer within 60 days. Spencer did not flinch. He had known for a decade that the empire was his. The numbers were a confirmation, not a surprise. Camilla allowed herself a small, well-trained smile. Then Crane turned a page and read my name. To my son Garrett Holloway, he said, I leave the following. The property located in the Crazy Mountains region of Sweet Grass County, Montana, approximately 340 acres of land with a single-structure log cabin. A sealed handwritten letter, to be opened by Garrett alone and only upon his arrival at that cabin. And the sum of $15,000 in cash, to be furnished as travel funds for his journey to the Montana property. The room went quiet, not the awkward kind. The polite kind, the silence that settles when everyone present is privately calculating how to arrange their face in response to something that has just revealed itself to be deeply, unmistakably lopsided. Camilla covered her mouth with two fingers and looked at the table. Spencer stared at his own hands. And Delphine's face moved through three expressions in the space of about 2 seconds. Shock, then arithmetic, then something colder that she caught and folded away before anyone but me could see it. My own face did nothing. I had learned somewhere between the ages of 10 and 15 how to hold my face perfectly still, and it had become the most useful skill my childhood ever gave me. Whitfield Crane looked at me over the rim of his glasses. Mr. Holloway, do you have any questions? No, I said, thank you. The cash is available to you today. The letter and a set of keys will be released to you together. The deed and survey for the Montana parcel were transferred into your name at midnight last night. Spencer cleared his throat. Whitfield, was there any explanation in the will for why it was structured this way? Crane turned to a separate page. There was a handwritten note from your father, I'll quote it. Spencer inherits the visible estate because the visible estate is his to run. Garrett inherits what I valued most. Do not interfere with it and do not pity him. Spencer blinked. What he valued most, a cabin? That was your father's phrasing, Crane said, not mine. Camilla made a sound then, not a laugh, but the involuntary exhale that lives next door to one. We left the tower in two directions. Spencer and Camilla took a car to Beverly Hills. Delphine and I took the elevator down 34 floors in silence, and she did not look at me until we reached the street, and when she did, the warmth I had spent 2 years trusting was simply not there anymore. It had been replaced by something busy and recalculating, like a woman reading a contract she has just realized she misunderstood. A cabin, she said in the car, in Montana. He left me a letter, Delphine. There's something he wanted me to understand. Your father just told you in writing in front of his lawyer that Spencer was the real son and you were the one he had to find a use for. And the use was a shack in the mountains and $15,000. Garrett read the room. We were married 11 days later. I have asked myself many times since why I did not stop it. Why I did not feel the floor tilting beneath me in those 11 days. And the only honest answer is that I was 37 years old and I had spent my entire life agreeing to the wishes of people who loved me less than I loved them. And I had not yet built the muscle that lets a man say no. The wedding had been booked for a year, a vineyard estate in the hills above Santa Barbara, 200 guests, a string quartet, a deposit that would not be refunded. Delphine had chosen everything. To call it off in those 11 days felt, to the man I was then, more impossible than going through with it. So I stood at the front of a tented terrace on the last Saturday in May under strings of warm light, and I watched Delphine Marsh walk toward me in a gown that cost more than my truck. And I told myself that the coldness in the car had been grief, hers and mine, and that it would pass. We said our vows. Spencer was there, generous and expansive, his name still hanging on a building in Century City. Camilla was there, polite. 200 people drank my brother's health and toasted a marriage that was already, though I did not yet know the hour of it, hours from its end. The reception began at 7. By 9, everything I thought I knew about my own life had been set on fire in front of 200 witnesses. It started, as these things do, with the toasts. Spencer rose first, glass in hand, and gave a speech that was warm in the way my brother was always warm, generous on the surface, immaculately about himself underneath. He welcomed Delphine to the family. He talked about our parents, about the legacy they'd left, about how proud our father would have been to see this day. And then, because Spencer could not help himself, because he had spent 42 years in the foreground of every room he had ever entered, he raised his glass and said, "And to my brother Garrett, who got the quiet end of the family deal but who's always been the steady one, somebody's got to hold the line." People laughed. It was meant kindly. It landed like a hand pressing my head gently underwater. Delphine had been drinking since the ceremony. I had watched her glass refill 4 times during dinner and had said nothing, because a man does not correct his bride at their wedding, and because I still believed at that hour that the night could be saved. Around 9 o'clock, when the band took its break and the terrace was quiet enough for a voice to carry, Delphine stood up. She steadied herself against the table, and she began to laugh, not a small laugh. A full theatrical rising laugh, the kind that travels across a room and stops every other conversation in its path. The string quartet stopped tuning, 200 people turned, Spencer set down his drink, Camilla's smile froze halfway up her face. "I'm sorry," Delphine said, still laughing, one hand pressed to her chest. "I'm sorry, I cannot stand up here for one more hour and pretend." She turned and found me at the head of the table, and the thing in her eyes was no longer cold, it had gone all the way to contempt. "I married a surveyor. Do you understand that? I married the son they left a shack to. Spencer got an empire and 3 cars and a house in Beverly Hills, and Garrett got a cabin in Montana and a letter like a child gets a birthday card, and he flew home and told me it might mean something. It might mean something." "Delphine." I said her name very quietly. "Please? No," she shook her head, and tears that were nothing like grief stood in her eyes. "No, I've been trying to understand for a year why I said yes, why I planned all of this, and I figured it out tonight standing right here. I felt sorry for you, that's the whole answer. I felt sorry for the man whose own father looked at 2 sons and chose the other one. I actually thought that there was a version of you waiting underneath, a version that would step out of Spencer's shadow once your parents were gone and the field was clear." She laughed again, wet and ugly. "But your own father just confirmed it in his will. You're the lesser one. You're going to stay the lesser one. And I am not going to spend my life as the wife who sits at the children's table at every holiday because her husband's own family doesn't respect him." The terrace was so silent I could hear the lights buzzing on their strings. "You are a useless loser, Garrett." She said it slowly, deliberately, so that all 200 guests could carry it home. "I've been thinking it for months and I was too polite to say it. Your parents said it for me. Spencer is going to say it for the next 40 years just by walking into a room, and I am out." She pulled the ring from her finger, set it on the white tablecloth beside her untouched cake, and gathered her gown in one fist. "Spencer, Camilla, enjoy the empire," she said. "Garrett, the ring's on the table, have fun in Montana." And she walked out. The door of the tented terrace did not slam because there was no door, only the open Santa Barbara night swallowing the sound of her heels on the stone path until that too was gone. 200 people sat in a silence that lasted perhaps 11 seconds, which is an unspeakably long time when those people have just watched a marriage end at its own reception. Somewhere a fork touched a plate and the sound was obscene in the stillness. The first person to move was my brother. Spencer crossed the terrace, crouched beside my chair, and for the first time in a very long time he looked at me without an ounce of condescension in his face. He looked at me the way one brother looks at another who has just been set on fire in public. "Garrett," he said low so only I could hear. "Jesus, I'm so sorry, she was drunk, she didn't mean half of that." "She meant all of it," I said. "She's been rehearsing it for months, she just needed 200 witnesses. What do you need? Tell me, I'll handle the guests, I'll handle the venue, I'll handle Camilla's mother, whatever it is." "I need everyone to go home," I said. "And I need you to not look at me like that, please." He nodded, he stood. He did the one genuinely useful thing my brother had ever done for me. He turned to 200 starring people and with the easy authority of a man who had commanded rooms his whole life, he thanked them for coming and told them the evening was over. Within 20 minutes the terrace had emptied of everyone but the catering staff folding chairs and a string quartet packing instruments they had barely played. I stood by the table with the ring on it and I did not pick it up. Camilla approached, made a sympathetic face she had clearly practiced, and told me that if I needed anything at all. I thanked her, she left. Spencer was the last to go, and at the edge of the terrace he turned back. "Come stay at the house," he said. "Don't go to some empty apartment tonight." "I'm not going to an apartment, Spencer. I'm flying to Montana in the morning." He stared at me. "Tonight." After all this, my father left me a letter. His instruction was that I open it alone at the cabin. "I've waited long enough." He almost said something. I could see it gathering behind his eyes, some version of "It's a shack, Garrett, it's frozen nowhere, don't humiliate yourself further chasing a dead man's apology." But he didn't say it. He just put his hand on my shoulder briefly, and then he took Camilla and he left, and I stood alone on a terrace strung with warm lights at my own ruined wedding, looking at a ring I had spent 9 months paying for. I did not sleep that night. I drove back to the apartment Delphine and I had shared, and she was already gone, closet half empty, a single hanger swinging where a dress had been. I packed a duffel, thermal layers, wool socks, boots, a headlamp, my father's property survey, the cabin key Whitfield Crane had pressed into my hand, and the letter, still sealed, writing in the inside pocket of my jacket where it would stay until I reached the cabin, because that was what my father had asked. At 4 in the morning, I called an airline and moved my flight from Monday to the first departure out of Los Angeles. Then I sat at the kitchen counter in the dark, in the apartment where I had built a life with a woman who had just called me a useless loser in front of 200 people, and I waited for the sky to gray, and I felt, underneath the wreckage, something I could not yet name beginning to harden into resolve. The journey took the better part of 2 days. Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, Salt Lake to Bozeman, a 4-hour drive north and east in a rented truck along highways that emptied themselves of traffic, then of towns, then of pavement. The mountains came up out of the plain like something risen rather than built. The crazies my father's deed had called them, the crazy mountains, a range that stood alone off the spine of the Rockies, sharp and snowblind and indifferent. I stopped in a town called Big Timber to buy fuel and supplies, and the woman at the counter, 70 if she was a day, looked at the coordinates I'd written on my hand and asked who I was visiting. Nobody, I said. I inherited some land up the sweet grass drainage. There's a cabin. She studied me a moment. Holloway Place? I must have shown my surprise because she nodded slowly. Errol Holloway, tall man, quiet, came through twice a year, every year far back as I can remember. Always bought the same coffee, lamp oil, canned goods, never said much about what he was doing up there. She rang up my supplies. You his boy, his younger one. She bagged the cans without looking up. He'd sit right where you're standing and drink a coffee before he drove up. Last time I saw him was September. Didn't know he'd passed until just now, hearing you say it. I'm sorry, son. The last 14 miles were not a road at all. A frozen 2-track through lodgepole pine, climbing a draw beside a creek locked under ribbed gray ice. I left the truck where the snow grew too deep and went the final stretch on foot, and then on a borrowed snowmobile that a rancher named Holly's Prout rented me out of his barn at the trailhead, along with a hand-drawn map and a warning to be back before dark or he'd come looking. Prout was 60-some, broad and weathered, and when I told him my name his whole manner changed. Errol's son, he said, it was not a question. I kept the key for your father when he couldn't get up here in the deep winter, plowed his 2-track, split his wood. He looked at me with the flat, patient assessment that men who live in hard country use on strangers. He told me more than once if a younger son ever came up here alone asking after the cabin, I was to help him and ask nothing. So that's what I'll do. Did he say why? No, Prout tightened a strap on the snowmobile. But I drove that man to this trailhead better than 30 times, and the way a man holds himself when he's guarding something, you learn to read it. Your father stood like he was sitting on a fortune up there. I figured it was the land, never asked, wasn't mine to ask. I rode the last miles northwest along the frozen creek, then up through a stand of spruce, and at a little after 2 in the afternoon on the second day I saw the cabin. It was small, 400 square feet of weathered log gone silver gray under 40 years of mountain wind, a stone chimney, a steep metal roof shedding snow in long blue shelves, a single south-facing door, a woodshed stacked tight under a tarp, an outhouse 30 feet back in the trees. No power lines, no wires of any kind. The nearest grid was 100 miles south. It was exactly what Delphine had called it from the safety of a Santa Barbara terrace. A shack, a cabin in frozen nowhere, the worthless inheritance handed to the worthless son. I shut off the snowmobile, and the silence that rushed in afterward was so complete it had a weight to it. I unlocked the door with my father's key, and I stepped inside the room where the rest of my life was waiting. The door opened onto a single room that smelled of cold ash and cedar, and the particular mustiness of a place sealed against winter. A cast-iron wood stove squatted in one corner. A cot stood against the north wall under a folded wool blanket. A small table with 2 chairs, a shelf of enamel plates and tin cups, a hurricane lamp, a tin of matches, a stack of split spruce beside the stove, and a cabinet of canned goods my father had laid in on his last visit in September, 4 months before the freeway and the town car and the end of him. I built a fire. My hands were stiff enough that it took 3 matches. Then I sat on the floor in front of the stove with my back against the cot, and I waited for the room to warm, which took the better part of 40 minutes. And I watched my own breath hang in the air of a building my dead father had raised by hand for reasons I did not yet understand. When the air was warm enough to hold paper without my fingers going clumsy, I took the letter from the inside pocket of my jacket. 5 pages folded once. My father's handwriting on the face of it, Garrett, to be opened at the cabin. I broke the seal. Garrett, it began. If you are reading this, I am gone, and you are sitting in a cabin I built in the summer of 1986, which means you made the trip. Thank you, I was not certain you would. You had every reason to believe this place was an insult, and you came anyway. That alone tells me the son I raised is the son I hoped he was, even if I spent his whole life failing to tell him so. Spencer inherited the visible estate because the visible estate was always going to be his. You inherited this, I know how it looks. Before you go a word further, I need you to understand that the division was never about love and never about worth. It was about fit. Spencer is the heir to what is visible. You are the heir to what I valued most, and what I valued most is what you are about to learn. I read those lines 3 times before I could make myself continue. Then the letter changed everything. In the summer of 1985, a year before I built this cabin, I came to Montana with a man named Augustus Vane, a field geologist, one of the finest in the country, though you will never have heard his name because he despised the spotlight and loved the backcountry more than recognition. Augustus was running a private mineral survey through the northern Rockies. He brought me up the sweet grass drainage to show me something the major companies had walked past for 60 years. Under these 340 acres, Garrett, sits a geological formation Augustus believed held one of the largest undeveloped deposits of rare earth elements in North America: neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, and others. In 1985, those minerals were nearly worthless. Neodymium traded for a few dollars a kilogram. Dysprosium was a laboratory curiosity. The mining majors ignored this ground because pulling the minerals out cost more than the minerals were worth. Augustus told me, and this is the sentence that changed the course of my life, that within 40 years these elements would become the most strategically vital commodities on Earth. He said, every electric motor, every wind turbine, every guided weapon, every phone and laptop and electric car the world will build is going to need what is sitting under this mountain. He said the deposit might be worth a few million in 1985. He said it could be worth 100 times that within a generation. He was wrong only in being too modest. I bought the 340 acres, mineral rights included, for $41,000. And I built this cabin as cover so that any man who asked would see a landowner who liked his solitude and never a man sitting on a fortune. I paid the property taxes every year for 40 years, the letter went on. I came up twice a year to maintain the cabin and walk the ground and keep the survey current. I told no one alive except your mother. Not my lawyers, not my partners, not Spencer, especially not Spencer. In 2021, when I was 68 and my heart had begun reminding me it was on a clock, I commissioned a full assay from an independent firm out of Denver. The complete report is in a steel box under the floorboard beneath the cot, along with Augustus Vane's last known contact, the original survey, and a list of 3 people in the rare earth industry I trust with my eyes closed. The assay confirmed everything Augustus told me in 1985, and a great deal he could not have predicted. Garrett, as of this writing, the surface land alone is worth perhaps $8 million. But the mineral rights, valued against the 2021 assay and the commodity prices of that year, came back at a figure I had to read 4 times before I believed it. Conservatively, $4 billion. With the right extraction partnership and where the rare earth markets are heading, the long-term recoverable value of this deposit is estimated between $12 and $15 billion. You are sitting on top of $15 billion, son, in a 400-square-foot cabin your sister-in-law would be embarrassed to be photographed beside. I set the pages down on the plank floor. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce with a sound like the sea, and I sat very still for a long time, the way a man sits when the floor of his understanding has been pulled out from under him and replaced with something he cannot yet stand on. Then I picked the letter back up because my father was not finished, and the part that came next was the part that broke me. Now I have to tell you why I left this to you and not to your brother, he wrote. Spencer is exactly the man I built him to be: fast, certain, brilliant at moving an asset from one hand to another. If I left him this ground, he would have a deal closed inside 90 days. He would take the cash, fold it into Holloway Estates, and the most strategically important thing I ever owned would become a line item in some mining conglomerate's annual report. He would cash out a 40-year secret for a quarter's worth of acquisitions. You are not that man. I know you do not see yourself the way I see you. I know I spent your childhood and the whole of your adult life telling you that you weren't built for the deal table, that you were the careful one, the one who keeps the lines straight. I told you that because it was true. And I told you that because it was the easiest way to keep the empire whole under Spencer and to spare this family the kind of succession war that has destroyed better families than ours. I made you smaller to keep my own peace, and that was the great cowardice of my life. I will not stand here in ink and tell you I was proud of you because I said too little of it while I breathed, and to spend it now would be cheap. But I will tell you this, and it is the truest thing I know. I chose you because you are the son who reads the letter before he acts. You are the son who measures before he trusts. A man who has spent 12 years making certain that boundaries hold, that lines are honest, that nothing is built on ground that will not bear it. That is precisely the man this deposit needs. Spencer would cash it out. You will build it right. The land has been here 1 billion years. It will wait for you. Take your time. Tell no one until you are ready. Augustus Vane is 81 now and living outside Missoula. The letter closed. He is expecting you. Do not call him from any phone that ties back to this family. The 3 names on the list under the floor are people I have known for decades: a woman in Denver, a man in Toronto, a firm in Perth. They will not cheat you and they will not rush you. Build something that honors this ground, Garrett. Do that and I will have been a better father in death than I ever managed to be in life. I love you. I was no good at saying it. I am sorry. Dad, I do not cry easily. I had not cried at either funeral, not at the will reading, not when Delphine set the ring on the tablecloth in front of 200 people. But sitting on the floor of that cabin with the fire burning low and the wind in the spruce and 5 pages of my dead father's handwriting in my stiff hands, I cried quietly the way I do everything, and it was not for the $15 billion. It was because somewhere underneath 37 years of choosing Spencer, my father had been watching me, cataloging my patience, my carefulness, my refusal to build on ground that would not hold. And when the hour came to decide which son to trust with the most important thing he had ever owned, he had chosen the son who had never once in his life felt chosen. I moved the cot aside. The floorboard beneath it was cut clean and seated loose. I worked it up with the blade of my knife. Inside sat a steel lockbox, and inside that, wrapped in waterproof plastic, a folder. The 2021 assay, 60-some pages, core photographs, chemical analysis, concentration figures for 6 rare earth elements that meant nothing to me yet and would soon mean everything. The original 1985 survey, the boundary lines hand-drawn and signed. A card with Augustus Vane's address near Missoula and a note in my father's hand. He is waiting. Use a phone that cannot be traced to us. And the list of 3, a woman in Denver, a man in Toronto, a firm in Perth, Australia, and one last thing, a second note shorter, 4 lines, the ink pressed harder into the paper as though my father had wanted to be sure it held. Garrett, this folder is your blueprint. Do not rush it. Do not tell Spencer until it is done and cannot be undone. Build something that honors this land, and you will honor me more than any son ever honored a father. Dad. I put it all back in the plastic, locked the box, and slept that night on the cot my father had slept on twice a year for 40 years, in a cabin on 340 acres of Montana wilderness that my bride had called a worthless inheritance the night she married me and left me in the same hour. In the morning I rode the snowmobile back down to the trailhead. Holly's Prout was waiting in the cold by his barn, and he looked at my face and did not ask what I'd found. You read it, he said. I read it, he nodded once, the way men of that country nod when a thing has been settled. Your father stood like he was guarding a fortune. I figured I had it right. Then he said the thing I have thought about every day since. Men like your father don't leave the important things to the loud son, they leave them to the one who'll do the work. I did not fly home. I drove to Missoula and I bought a cheap prepaid phone in a gas station and I called Augustus Vane. He answered on the 3rd ring, an old man's voice, dry and amused. Errol's boy, he said before I'd finished my name. I wondered when you'd come. Sit down, there's more your father couldn't fit in a letter. Augustus Vane lived in a small house full of rock samples and topographic maps, and over a pot of strong tea he confirmed every word of my father's letter and then corrected it in the only direction that mattered. Your father was conservative, he said, turning a chunk of dark ore over in his spotted hands. He valued that ground against 2021 prices. The world has changed since. Electric vehicles, grid storage, the scramble to pull rare earth supply out of China's hands, it's all driven these elements through the roof. That deposit isn't worth 12 to 15 billion anymore as a someday figure, son. Developed correctly over its life, it clears 15 billion and keeps climbing. It is one of the 5 largest untapped rare earth reserves on the continent. The majors have been circling it for 15 years. Your father never once returned their calls. He was waiting to hand the choice to the right man. He looked at me over his tea. He decided that was you. I'd not bet against Errol Holloway. He was right about ore for 60 years, and I expect he was right about his son. I flew home and I told no one. Not Spencer, who had already begun the work of restructuring the empire that was now entirely his. Not Delphine, who within weeks was posting photographs of a sunlit new life and a caption about finally choosing herself. I let her keep the verdict she had delivered in front of 200 people, because correcting it would have required telling her the truth, and the truth was no longer hers to have. I took an extended leave from the surveying firm, then quietly resigned in midsummer. I called the 3 names under the floorboard. I met the woman in Denver and flew to see the firm in Perth. Every one of them independently confirmed what Augustus had said. The land was worth what my father claimed and more. The right path would take 3 to 5 years and a partner who built rather than stripped, and the wrong path, selling to the highest bidder, would leave billions on the table and put a 40-year secret into the hands of men who would gut it in a decade. I chose Perth. They had the finest record in rare earth development on Earth, and they were willing to put up capital and take a minority stake while I held the ground my father had held. It is spring again now, a year on. I am 38. I live in a rented 2-bedroom outside Bozeman and drive a used truck because the partnership is confidential and the early capital goes to permits and environmental review and lawyers, not to a new face for an old life. Extraction is still 2 years out. But the deposit is real. The agreement values it north of $15 billion, and the man who measured other people's land for 12 years now owns the most valuable ground in the northern Rockies, and is building it slowly, carefully, the way his father knew he would. So let me ask you something before you go. What would you do if everyone who was supposed to see you clearly, your parents, your brother, the person you married, all looked at you and concluded you were the lesser one? Would you let their verdict become your own? Would you wear it like a coat you never take off? Or would you go to the cabin? Would you open the letter? Would you trust just once that the people who made you small might simply have been wrong and that the strange, quiet, worthless-looking thing they handed you might be the most carefully chosen gift of your life? Because here is what that cabin taught me. Some inheritances aren't about money at all. Some are about finally being seen. If this story stirred something in you, leave a comment below. I read everyone. Hit like, share it with someone who's been called the lesser one by people who should have known better, and subscribe so you never miss another story. I'll see you in the next one.